1 in 3 people on the planet has had an unsafe level of lead in their blood.
Everyone, my name is Kendra Seymour, and I'm so pleased to welcome our guest today, Tamara Rubin. She's also known as the Lead Safe Mama. So thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, you have basically dedicated your life to raising awareness and advocating for changes around lead in our homes and buildings and products. And it's really because of what happened to you and your own family that you started down this path. So can you tell us a little bit about what led you down this path of advocacy?
So my kiddos were acutely lead poisoned back in 2005, and I didn't have context for what that meant, and we didn't know what had happened. When it happened, we didn't know until after the fact that it had happened. So what the specifics of what happened were that we hired a contractor who used an open flame torch, and he used the torch to burn the paint off the exterior of our home, and that caused the leaded fumes to become airborne. And my baby, who was 7 months old at the time, inhaled the fumes. So the issue at the time was that no one was looking at lead poisoning in children under the age of 1. People weren't looking at lead poisoning in middle income families. People weren't looking at lead poisoning in white families. So as a result, my kiddos were not tested until more than 2 months after they were poisoned, even though they were violently ill for 2 months straight. So that exacerbated the problem, because we were living in the home and it was probably highly contaminated, but we didn't know it at the time. And I kept contacting the doctor saying, test my kids, I need to know what's wrong with them. And they refused to do that because we were white and middle income. And finally, one morning, my son, who was a little over 3 at the time, woke up covered head to toe in feces. And that's like not a thing you share often, but if you can imagine, I'm no longer a parent of toddlers, and it's far enough removed that the trauma of it is not present to me. But if you can imagine being that parent with a toddler who literally is covered in, after being sick for 2 months, you're like, okay, we're getting this is getting handled. So that's when I took him into the doctor, and I said, you have to test him for everything. This is not normal. He's been throwing up all over the car. Every time we go anywhere, he's been throwing up and pooping everywhere. He's potty trained. This is too much work for me to clean up all the time. There's got to be something wrong with him. It's not normal. And it was that incident that, since I had a physiological impact that the doctors couldn't ignore, that led them to testing for everything they could. They did stool testing, blood testing, urine testing, physical exam, eye testing to see, neurological testing to see if he had some sort of neurological imbalance that was contributing. And the end result was, the only thing that came up positive was that he tested positive for lead in his blood. And that, even at that point, he was only a blood level of 4.0. And they said, oh no, he's okay. They put okay on the test result and said he's fine. And that made me think, if my 3-year-old is positive for a blood level 4, what does that mean for my baby? And I should get my baby tested too. And they basically were refusing to test my baby, and I insisted. And they finally said okay. And when they tested Avi, we got a call back right away saying, you have to move out of the house immediately. Your baby tested positive. He was a blood level 16 at the time. And what that means, right now, the current federal level of concern, which is different language than it was 17 years ago, is a blood level of 3.5. That's not the level at which a child is considered poisoned. A child is poisoned when they have any lead in their blood at all, because the natural background level of lead in blood prior to the Industrial Revolution was a 0.016. So Avi's level at 16 was over 1,000 times that. And then the natural level during the Black Plague in Europe, which is when all of the workers who did mining died, all the young men died. So mining on the planet ceased for a period. The Harvard scientists determined that the natural level of lead in blood was far below that 0.016. So when you have a blood level 16, your kiddo's acutely poisoned. But then the issue also there is that he wasn't tested until months after he was poisoned, and there's a 30 to 45 day half-life in the blood. So if you look at that, he might have been a 32 a month before, and he might have been a 64 a month before that, and that's consistent with his both of the children's violent symptoms, that they must have been much higher from the initial exposure when they inhaled the toxic fumes.
Oh my gosh, I am so sorry because there's I think probably a lot of parents listening who've had to go through that struggle of your kid is sick and they're told, well, it'll pass or whatever, and time keeps going by, and your mom gut, I imagine, is screaming. There's something else that's going on here. So you talked about the blood lead level. Just to be clear, like there's no safe level, correct, in the body, but
Right.
the government has a threshold, don't they?
Yes. So there's no safe level of lead exposure to children. They've shown negative health impacts in adults, and specifically of interest is they've shown negative health impacts in women of childbearing age at levels as low as 0.43. Well, that's, that's about 3 times the pre-industrial revolution level of 0.016. So 0.43 has been considered to be a trivial amount of lead, and that's micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood. And yet, when Dr. Felicia Rubito at Tulane University did a study of population levels of lead exposure in women of childbearing age, what she found is that there was significant correlation of levels even as low as 0.43 with fertility impacts and low birth weight in newborns, infertility, and other birth complications. And because of that, we now know that even these really low levels that are considered safe are harmful. So if a level as low as 0.43 is interrupting a fundamental biological function like birth and conception, what are those higher levels doing to our kiddos? And what we're seeing across the board in our human population all over the planet is an increased incidence of diseases like cancer and kidney disease and diabetes and all of these other things, heart disease. And recently, the United Nations got on board and actually followed my playbook. I've been talking about how 1 in 3 children in the United States under the age of 18 has had an unsafe level of lead in their blood in their lifetime. And my focus, since I was looking in the United States, was about the United States impacts. But the recent United Nations study that was published, I believe it was July after the start of the pandemic, so July of 2020, miraculously 10 years after I was talking about this, it said, hey, 1 in 3 people on the planet has had an unsafe level of lead in their blood. Unfortunately, the big problem that keeps this marginalized and doesn't and results in a limited amount of resources allocated to addressing the problem is even this United Nations report focused on this being a low-income problem. Like they said, low-income countries. What the hell is a low-income country? And no, it's not true that it's just a low-income country. It's all countries. And that's the problem across the board with this issue, is they're trying to pigeonhole this into being a demographically focused concern when demographics have nothing to do with it. I mean, especially in this day and age when people of all demographics might live in an older home, or people of all demographics might have leaded consumer goods in their home, because lead is so prevalent in our environment. And then the other frustrating bit there is that a lot of the studies, in addition to focusing on this misguided concern that it's a low-income problem or a low-income country problem, also are focusing on the soil, saying, well, soil's contaminated, and so, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, no, I've tested soil. I do consumer goods testing using XRF technology, and I've tested soil actually from all over the world, and I find lead-free soil all over the world. So it's about soil contamination caused by industry, caused by lead paint sanding, caused by leaded gasoline. And it's not an insurmountable problem. It's something we can deal with. We have put this lead into our environment, and we need to find ways to address it and I think the key, and this is a fundamental point of my advocacy work, is that until we recognize that this is an everyone problem, we will not allocate the funding politically, and the political will not be driven into addressing this as an everyone problem. As long as this is marginalized and people think it's just a low-income minority problem, for example, and not saying that that's not a significant issue, it is, but as long as it's compartmentalized, then our federal agencies are going to focus on funding this as a low income minority problem and not generating 10 times the funding to actually eradicate the problem. And unfortunately, systemic racism is baked into the issue of lead poisoning. And the lead industry actually used systemic racism. They capitalized on it by using systemic racism in the 1910s, 1920s, 19 teens, in that era, where it was, I would say at a height, although perhaps one could argue it's a height now, but using that as a tool to say, well, this is not an everyone problem, and saying this was only a problem for low-income Black women who weren't cleaning their houses. That was the marketing materials from the lead industry, the internal minutes of their meetings. That was their focus in the 1920s, is trying to make everyone think that this was a low-income Black problem. And by doing so, we wouldn't get federally regulated initiatives, and we wouldn't get federal funding into eradicating the problem.
That is really, I think, an important message. It's something we talk about at Change the Year too, that this is something that affects everyone, regardless of income, race, whether you live in Alaska or Hawaii or around the world. It's something that we all need to be aware of. So let's talk about this, because for those listening, Tamara has a wonderful documentary, and if we have a chance near the end, we can talk about it. But she kind of alluded to some of the historical changes in lead and how that has changed, over time. So let's talk about like modern day today, because you're right. I think people think, well, I only have to worry about it if my house was built prior to 1978, or, gas is another way, but, we're moving towards unleaded fuel in the last couple of decades. But there are some big sources in and around our home. And can you tell us what those are, and maybe highlight some of the biggest offenders that people may not be thinking of?
Yeah, I just want to also, I'll go there. I just want to just make sure I'm clear about the previous point, and that, yes, low-income minority families are disproportionately impacted. I'm not saying that that's not the case. And the reason that they're disproportionately impacted is because if you're low income, you don't necessarily have the resources to move, or to get new dishes, or to address the problem, or even have appropriate health care. So there are factors that make it worse for low-income minority families, but it's an everyone problem, and we should be addressing this as a population, as an everyone problem. And one piece of that too is that I often talk about is in other countries like Denmark and Finland, the Scandinavian countries primarily, public health is seen as a public health initiative. It's public, it's for everyone, it's for all the population. In the United States, public health is seen as a low-income program. So if you have public health insurance in the United States, that means you are low income, and public health interventions are for low-income families. Whereas in Finland, public health initiatives are for all the people, because all the people are part of the public. So that's part of the disconnect in terms of addressing this problem, is that we have this compartmentalization of what the public is, or what public health is, and who should get public services, and who is deserving of public services. It should be every citizen. All right, now we move on to consumer goods. So lead in consumer goods is a huge problem. If you look on my website any day, you'll see me reporting on consumer goods that test positive for lead. Now, the frustrating thing is that even when lead has been outlawed in specific consumer goods, and the only consumer goods that it's fundamentally outlawed in is items intended for use by children, companies will promote their products and say that they are lead free, when in fact they have lead and have unsafe levels of lead. There's something I posted today about a cup that is being sold as a children's cup and has an unsafe level of lead, and the company is saying that it's lead free. Luckily, this company is responding proactively and engaging with me, and taking me seriously. A lot of times companies will say, oh, well, this is just some blogger. And I'm like, no, I'm not a blogger. I have a blog, but I'm not a blogger. I use science to do consumer goods testing to determine if things are in compliance with the regulatory standards set for children. Now, the only recourse that we have with this is if it's an item manufactured for children. However, unfortunately, the federal regulations don't consider dishware to be items intended for use by children. So dishware, any dishes, ceramic dishes primarily are the issue, made today or last year or whenever recently, can have unsafe levels of lead in them, because they're not intended to be used by children, which is ridiculous, of course. And mugs have unsafe levels of lead almost always. Very rarely are they lead free. And every now and then we'll see a shift, and a company will shift to lead free because they got some smart person on their product sourcing committee or whatever. And the main example I have is Starbucks. There was a period when I started doing consumer goods testing back in 2009, when I had tested a bunch of old Starbucks mugs and they were all positive for lead. But then all of these Starbucks mugs I was testing that were made in 2009, 2010, 2011, they seemed to be lead free. And I wrote Starbucks and I said, thank you. What are you doing here that you are making lead free mugs when you used to make leaded mugs? And how are you doing this? And they wrote back and they said, well, it's a priority for us to have lead-free mugs. So then at that point, I was sharing with people, oh, well, your Starbucks mugs are likely lead-free. And then boom, I started testing a bunch more, and now they're leaded again. And I'm like, what happened? And well, obviously they have a different person in charge of the program. The person who had spearheaded the initiative to make sure their mugs were lead-free left. And then the person who came in on board didn't necessarily realize that that was part of the reasoning for the sourcing of materials and suppliers and glazes that they had. And then they switched to cheaper sources, or switched to sources that weren't cognizant of the concerns for lead in consumer goods. So then, so it's not brand specific. Any brand is going to have potentially high levels of lead. And again, that's specifically in ceramics. That's a concern today. And the other thing that I look for is other toxicants. My instrumentation that I use for the testing I do tests for lead, cadmium, mercury, antimony, all these other things. Well, antimony wasn't added to the list of known carcinogens. I mean, it was a known carcinogen, but it wasn't added to the official list of carcinogens until December of 2021. It's molecularly similar to lead. It's used in place of lead. So here's where things get frustrating, so leaded crystal is bad. Leaded crystal leaches lead into the beverage that it contains, especially if that beverage is acidic, like wine or juice, or basically most beverages have some level of acidity. And the studies that have been done show that it leaches that lead to a dangerous level starting at about an hour. But the thing that I have always said is, well, what happens up to that hour? It's not like magically there's a certain amount that's dangerous that's leached at an hour. It's building up over time. And so it's dangerous all the time, given we know there's no safe level of lead exposure and what we know about the impact on fertility. So it's never safe to use crystal, and the crystal industry has tried to support propaganda. There's legislative exceptions for crystal to have lead and have that be legal. But anyway, so the crystal industry is like caught on, okay, it's not good to have lead, let's make lead-free crystal. So what are they using instead of lead in that crystal? They're using antimony, which is equally carcinogenic and likely equally possible to leach, but hasn't been studied yet because it's newly added to the list of carcinogens. So you test a lead-free crystal goblet, and it has a high level of antimony. And so I do recommend, for example, that people avoid any blown glass vessels for drinking, because it'll likely have a high level of antimony. So what I do is I test these consumer goods and I find toxicants, and then I recommend safer choices on my website, which is letsafemama.com or tamararubin.com. And I hate recommending products because there's always a change. Like I said about the Starbucks mugs, it's a good example. It's like I can recommend something and say, okay, well, these have consistently tested lead free, and then boom, they're leaded, the next year. And I have no control over that. So I recommend products reluctantly, because my readers ask for that. And what I'm trying to do here is not recommend products and not create a culture of consumerism. I really hate what that does for the planet, for the air, for the impact of manufacturing, when people are buying new products to replace things. I think it's kind of interesting because I'm on Instagram, and a lot of the Instagram profiles are like safer swaps. I'm like, okay, so what safer swaps mean? Like that phrase is
Right.
throwing something out and buying something new. And that's not what I want to have happen. I want you to throw out the toxic stuff and use what you have left over. You don't need nonstick pans. You don't need fancy ceramic ware. Just use the simple stuff that's non-toxic that you have already. And if you really don't have a non-toxic option, you can get one inexpensively. But I really hate this culture of consumerism we're in, where people are spending so much money to try and get to a place of non-toxic living, when in fact that place of non-toxic living is where we start. It's simplification, it's minimalism, and I know that's hard for people. But I just one example that's really frustrating for me that I talk about in terms of the global impacts is with cadmium, because a lot of companies now are using cadmium in their colorants instead of lead, or where they're in addition to lead. And so anything that's bright yellow or bright red, I've tested Starbucks mugs where the entire inner lining of the mug is yellow, and therefore it's really high in cadmium. And then there's like Le Creuset, where all the exterior colorful components are high in cadmium. That's the reds and the yellows and the oranges. And those may or may not be poisoning the end user. That's not the concern. Those pigments, the fact that they are calling for in their production, the mining, refining, and manufacturing of the pigments, you're poisoning the workers, you're poisoning the land, you're poisoning the waterway, and you're poisoning the air through this superfluous need, it's like need in quotes, to have decorative elements in your kitchen. What the heck? That's not okay. So it's about also, increasing awareness globally that it's only in the last 100 years, maybe 120 years, that we've been doing this too, and that we don't need these things, and that these things are making the planet worse for future generations. And I forget the Native American, is it the seventh generation, the seven generations, think 7 generations in the future. Gee, I hate to say that without mentioning a product brand because of that cycle, but you want to think 7 generations into the future. And I think that should be with all of our consumption, and that includes our homes. It's very frustrating that homes are being built inexpensively with like MDF and the glues and formaldehydes and all the junk that goes into that. It's frustrating. And I don't have an answer to what's going to happen with that, but I just think we need to look at everything we consume, and one of the things we consume is our homes. And we need to investigate each of those things. And my goal is to help families have tools to look at those things from a science-based perspective, so that they can make informed choices and hopefully not worry about too much, but just take one thing at a time and make informed choices as they go. I'm babbling a bit here, but one of the things that it's okay.
No, it's good that you're hitting all these great points. It's everything we want to hear. Absolutely. Keep going.
So the one thing I often talk about is car seats, because young moms today put so much research into which car seat. I mean, even moms who aren't environmentally educated, really, if they're going to look at anything, they look at their car seat. So they look at the materials and whether or not there's fire retardants and the safety ratings and the reviews, and they really research their car seat. And I would argue that a lot of people don't put that much effort into researching the materials of their home or other things that they use every day. And the main thing is too, if you're going to put that much time into researching your car seat, you only do it once, then you buy your car seat and you're done. Well, so it doesn't have to take over your life, right? It's not like an ongoing inquiry. The same can be true with lead and other toxicants in consumer goods. Research your dishes once, and then that's handled. You pick, so it doesn't have to take over a lot of your time, just the time when you make the initial choices for what to bring into your home, and which choices might be safer for your family.
Yeah. I love how you're framing this in that message, because it can feel very overwhelming, and you're telling people like, you don't panic, because that doesn't help anyone. You stop and you start with the thing in front of you, your dishes, your toys. So let's talk about some of those tools you mentioned. Is there a reliable like at-home test that the average consumer could do? Can you talk to us about what choices somebody might have, and the pros and cons of those?
Well, so there's only one type of test kit that works on paint. That is the 3M lead check swabs. There's these cheap ones that they sell that are, I posted the other day, they're garbage. They're literally garbage. You might as well just tear up your money, put it in the garbage, and say, oh, look, I tested my stuff. See, I put my money in the garbage, because that's the same benefit you'll get from the results of those cheap tests. The 3M test kits are only designed to test for lead in paint. They have a minimum threshold, a low threshold of detection of 600 parts per million. So toxic children's toys are considered toxic at 90 parts per million and up in the paint. So if a toy tests negative with a lead check swab, that doesn't mean that it's negative to a level that is safe for children. So they're actually not useful on testing toys. They also don't work on glazes. They mostly work on paint. There are some vintage dishware items that they will work on, which is like the Franciscan apple and the Franciscan rose that are really popular in the United States. Those will often test positive with a lead check swab because they are like exuding lead dust, and they won't always though, but they still will poison someone. Just because something tests negative with a lead check swab and it's a consumer good doesn't mean it's actually negative. And so that's why I've done what I've done. It's frustrating for people that there are no home test kits that are sufficient. On top of that, the lead check swabs are only testing for lead. I'm testing for cadmium, arsenic, mercury, and antimony, and there's no home test kit for those things. So that's why I've designed my database. And this seems like a plug, but it's, in a way it is, but in a way it's not. My database, my website is a database. It is a database of consumer goods. There's right now over 3,550 pages and posts with information. About 3,000 of them are consumer goods test results. The website's been live since 2013, and I have been posting test results since then. And as I've gotten older and as I've learned from my readers, I've increased what I'm reporting. So I used to just report the lead levels, but now I report all the metals found using XRF technology. So if there's an older test, it'll tell you whether or not there's lead. And then like if there's a test from 5 years ago, it might say whether or not there's lead and cadmium. Well, now I tell you if there's lead, cadmium, mercury, antimony, all those things. So some of the older posts I need to update and test other examples with more thorough testing, because I didn't used to do it as comprehensively as I do now. But my website is free to access, and it's funded by the ads on the website, which are really annoying. But that way it's self-funded, so there's no corporate influence into what I'm testing and what I'm reporting. No one will yank their funding from me if I tell you that their products are toxic. And so that's really important for me. And I used to have a nonprofit, and in fact, the nonprofit was destroyed by likely corporate interests influence on the nonprofit. And so I think, even the nonprofit model can be compromised in terms of the integrity and neutrality of what you write about and test and report on. So what I've tried to do with my website is create a searchable database where anyone can look up their product. Now, you might not find your exact product, but you'll find something by that brand or something of that age or something that looks similar, or something made of the same materials. And you can then extrapolate. Like, so you'll find a Fisher-Price toy from 1975 that has orange and yellow plastic, and you'll see the lead levels or cadmium levels on those, and you can kind of say, okay, well, mine probably has a similar result. So yeah, I don't have everything on there yet, and it's a growing system, like database of information. But I think that right now, that's one of the best ways to look and see if your products are toxic. Unfortunately, a lot of the nonprofits that are purporting to do similar kinds of work have corporate influence. And for example, EWG, I just wrote about recently, they give #1 ratings to, I think it's 24 different products that have unsafe levels of lead. And I have, I'm starting a petition to ask them to remove those. I did a letter. I wrote a template letter so people can write to EWG to remove the leaded products from their #1 rating list. But, it makes you wonder, how does EWG, which is a trusted resource for toxic and profiles of consumer goods, give #1 ratings to toothpaste and other things that folks might interact with their bodies when they are positive for lead and known to be positive for lead? I don't know, corporate influence is the only answer I can think of.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right. You alluded to something else earlier too, that sometimes you'll see this in a lot of consumer goods. They will take out one bad thing like BPA, right? And then they swap it with something else and they claim it's safer, but really it's just untested, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes those swaps end up being just as bad, maybe worse. We don't know yet.
Right.
And so time will tell. So your website is we're going to link to Tamara's website, but she also has a wonderful documentary. In your documentary, though, something that I thought was really interesting, because maybe somebody listening is like, well, all right, I don't really have kids or toy, it doesn't really affect me. I have my dishes that are safe, but there are things like opening and closing a window, right? If the house was pre-1978, and was painted with lead paint, it doesn't matter if you're not licking the window. I don't mean to make light of it, but that's what people think. Don't eat the paint chips. And it's not that. Can you talk to us about how something as simple as opening and closing a window can lead to lead exposure?
Yeah, so actually, the scientists that I have spoken to, and again, my film is not these words coming out of my mouth, but it's these words and sentiments coming out of the mouths of the top scientists and researchers in the country. So it's maybe unbiased, hopefully unbiased, and very scientifically rigorous. But a lot of the scientists I interviewed for my film agreed that about 90% of lead poisoning today is caused by opening, closing old windows original windows in an old lead painted home. Now, the interesting thing is that the lead painted wooden windows are one source, but also aluminum windows from the 50s and 60s are lead contaminated aluminum in many cases. And so it's not just the lead in the paint, but when you have lead in paint or you have lead on any friction surface, including aluminum that might be dusting and chalking, it creates microparticulate dust that impacts your environment. And the best example that a lot of the scientists use and that I've written about on my website is the sugar packet example, which is one sugar packet worth of lead dust spread evenly across a football field is enough to contaminate the football field to 38.5 micrograms per square foot. The hazard level currently has been lowered to 10 micrograms per square foot. So that's 1/4 of a packet of sugar worth of lead dust. So if you take 1/4 of a packet of sugar worth of lead dust and spread that evenly across the football field, that'll get you to approximately 10 micrograms per square foot, which is the current federal hazard level for lead in dust. Now, the scientific recommendation that's protective of human health, which the federal recommendation is not, the scientific recommendation is that the hazard level be lowered to 5 micrograms per square foot. So that's 1/8 of a sugar packet worth of lead dust spread evenly across a football field is approximately 5 micrograms per square foot. So that's how toxic lead dust is. So when you're opening and closing your window, you might not see any dust, but over time you can look in the window well, and if you wipe it with a wet wipe, you'll see dust accumulating, and over time you'll see chips on the outside edge of the window, on the friction surfaces, also doors, and you might not notice it missing at the time, but it's not visible to the naked eye, the amount of lead that it takes to poison a child or an adult. And I just want to swing back around there because you were talking about naysayers, and I have a couple of articles about that. People say, "Oh, we were fine. We were exposed to lead paint," and the problem is previous generations weren't exposed to lead paint in the same way. It wasn't deteriorating the way it is now. We weren't doing renovations and home demolitions and contaminating our air and our communities through a demolition and renovation processes the way we are now. Gentrification has gone into full swing, especially with the pandemic. The gentrification homeowners doing their own upgrades of their homes, contaminating their own homes that way has been significant. And the other thing I like to mention often is that when I talk about reproductive health, we first go to fertility, but when you want to engage a man in the conversation, mention that reproductive health impacts them too. And one of the big impacts of lead exposure is erectile dysfunction, which I always laugh about. I don't know, I'm nervous about sex talking, but erectile dysfunction, that's a big thing. People that's important to men. So if you want to get a man in your life, or if you are a man and you want to say, is this impacting me? Well, I don't know, how are things going down there? And then, beyond that, in men, they've shown an increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of early death from heart attacks. They've studied groups of contractors and people who work with lead on a regular basis, and they're more likely to have heart impact, also increased risk of kidney disease. And the other two primary ones, both are very noticeable, is increased risk of early cognitive decline, early onset Alzheimer's and things like that. And then also an increased risk of arthritis. So a lot of men who work in, hands-on fields where they're working with lead, either in shooting or fishing or hunting or as hobbies, or in work in construction fields, they'll get arthritis in their hands quite young, in their 30s and 40s, and sometimes even younger. And that is often because of lead exposure. And if someone has any of these symptoms, they should consider getting a blood level test if they are working in an industry where they have lead exposure. And the other really important piece of that is that OSHA has set levels, and there are levels. One of the hazard levels for adult men is 40 micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood. And another hazard level is 25. Neither of those levels are protective of human health. Like I said, with women, we're showing fertility impacts at levels as low as 0.43. So if you're an adult man and you have a blood level of 1 or 2 from your work, you have a definite source of exposure beyond what population levels are. And you need to look at that if you want to live longer and live healthier, and be cognitive, have your brain intact for more of your life.
So I want to, because I know we're running low on time here. There's just so much I want to ask you, but I kind of want to circle, like if somebody is living in a home pre a certain time period and it's time to maybe renovate or replace the windows, what can they do? Because in your situation, you hired someone. I'm sure you thought that they checked all the boxes, and their unsafe practices essentially poisoned your family. And you kind of alluded to there really aren't a lot of laws in place. So like, can you talk to us about what lead safe practices are when it comes to repainting a home or things like that?
Well, so my kids were poisoned in 2005, and I helped get the EPA RRP rule passed in 2008. I testified before committees and locally and nationally on some panels. So the new law since 2008 is the EPA RRP rule, repair, renovation, and painting rule. And if you're hiring a contractor, you need to hire an EPA RRP certified contractor. And that's actually the law. You have to, if they're going to work on a pre-1978 house, if they're going to disturb more than 6 feet of interior space, I believe, and more than 20 feet of exterior space. But really, if they're going to disturb anything, you want to hire an EPA RRP certified contractor. And in addition to that, you want to call and get their references. You want to check their license and see that there's been no complaints. You want to check with the Better Business Bureau to see that there's been no complaints there. You want to see their EPA RRP certificate and make sure that it hasn't expired. You want to make sure that an EPA RRP trained and certified contractor is going to be on site at your home during the entire project. You don't just want them having their subs there on the project. You want to make sure you have someone trained and certified overseeing the work and participating in the work. And most importantly, you want to not live in the home. No matter how small the project is, you want to be not there. You want to stay somewhere else. And then finally, you want to have someone babysit the contractors because you can't trust them. And it's not that they're not maybe trustworthy people. It's that they might cut corners by accident or maybe on purpose, but you have to have someone babysitting the contractors. One woman messaged me yesterday and told me that she just did this massive renovation on her home. And then she needed to do some more work on her home, and she had cameras in her garage, and the contractors were working on her garage, and so she got to watch everything. And they didn't wear booties. They tracked lead dust through the garage living space. It was like a garage apartment, I believe. They didn't put tarping down on the outside. They were certified contractors, but they cut lots of corners. So that's another thing to do, is consider having a camera system. But I think it's better to have someone there who understands lead safe work practices overseeing them, that is part of your family or your home, whoever lives with you. I think one of the ways to do that is to do an EPA RRP training yourself as a citizen, just so when you hire an EPA RRP trained contractor that they're doing things right, and you know what that looks like. Now, a lot of my friends are EPA RRP trainers. A lot of the trainers use my materials in their trainings, either videos I've developed or language I've developed. And so if a parent contacts me and they want to take an EPA RRP training course, I can normally get them in for free. So, you can email me. My email is tamararubin@mac.com, or I don't always check my other email very often, but it's tamara@leadsafemama.com. The best one's the first one. And you can email me, say, I want to take the training. I'm a homeowner. I'm going to hire some contractors. I want to know what to look for. And I can probably connect you, especially now in the world of Zoom, post-pandemic. If we are post-pandemic, a lot of the trainings are done remotely, and it's easier for trainers to have you sit in on a training to learn what you're supposed to be looking for. And then I want to reiterate, move out of the house. Don't live there with your family. Any rooms that are being worked on shouldn't have any contents in the room. Any furniture or personal possessions should be moved out into storage or sealed off in a room that isn't being worked on. And before you move back in, you need to do clearance testing to make sure that the home is safe to move back into. And clearance testing is specifically dust wipe samples throughout the home, as many as you can afford to do, that demonstrate that the level of lead on the floor and any horizontal surfaces is less than 5 micrograms per square foot. Anything over 5 micrograms per square foot is potentially harmful to your family. And a lot of the clearance testing labs only do less than 10 as a minimum threshold. So you have to do some homework first and find a lab that does less than 5. Because as I said earlier, the scientific recommendation that's protective of human health is that the hazard level should have been set at 5 micrograms per square foot. And that's information that's been hanging around since the 1990s when the hazard level was set at 40. So the government knew that 5 micrograms per square foot was what needed to be set as the hazard level, but instead they set the hazard level at 40. And again, the new hazard level is 10. So anything above 5, if your floors test positive for levels over 5, then you still have a hazard and you need to do additional cleaning. And the final, I guess I kept saying final, but the final point on that is, so you have to leave yourself time. You have to leave a month or several weeks or multiple months, depending on the size of the job, to do the clearance testing, which might take a week or so to get the results back, and then for it to fail, and then do another round of cleaning and another round of clearance testing to make sure your home is safe. A lot of people don't set enough time. So they do the clearance testing and then they move back in, assuming it's going to be safe. And then they find out that it isn't safe. And then their kids are poisoned when they move back into their home because there were dust hazards. And that is a very common, very, very common experience of families moving back into their home after work has been done as part of a renovation or any repainting even.
That's really important. And that's not too different from moving in after remediation for mold or water damage. You want to make sure that clearance testing. And I'm so bummed we are pretty much out of time, but I know your website, you have information on that dust test. I believe there's a video of your son doing it and lots of great resources there. Tamara, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for being a voice of reason and for advocating for something, because I know how hard your journey's been. You've talked about it. I can't even imagine, but thank you so much. Is there a last final thought to just send us off on our way as we start thinking about lead in our homes and what we can do to make a healthier home?
Well, check out my channels, my social media channels, my videos. It's all at Lead Safe Mama. There's information there. I also share about my personal journey. And then get your children tested. Even if you don't think they have a risk, get a blood lead test for them annually through the teen years, because it doesn't hurt to have a baseline. If they're negative now, excellent. We want to know that they're negative. And if then they do soapbox derby when they are 10 years old and a Boy Scout and they melt lead to put in their car and you're like, oh, they might have been poisoned, then you can do a test and follow up, and you will have a baseline from now showing that they were negative and that there's likely exposure from some incidental thing that they did. And if they test positive, then you have something to handle right away and you caught it early, hopefully. So get your kids tested, even if you don't think you need to get your kids tested, and then test them annually through the teen years.
I love that. And that's important too, because they're not just home. They go to daycare, they go to school, they go to other environments that, could be potential exposures, and you want to be aware of that. Well, thank you so much. And, I would love to talk with you again in the future, if that's okay, because there's so much I want to pick your brain about. And I'm sure we're going to get a bunch of follow-up emails and questions. So Tamara, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again.